All right, we're live, everyone. So we have Richard Chappell, who is a philosopher. He has quite a good blog that I have linked in the below the video, and he also has the honor of having been replied to by Parfit, which most of us will not have the opportunity for that to be the case. So I think the main thing that we're going to discuss is going to be hedonism versus desire theory, versus objective list theory as a theory of the good. So do you want to just lay out sort of the basic case for objective list theory?
Sure. I mean, the basic idea, one way into it is to think that hedonism is itself a form of objective list theory, just one with a very short list. There's the only item on it is pleasure. And then from there, the basic case for a broader form of objective list theory is to think, well, doesn't it sure seem like other things matter besides pleasure? So objectivist theory will certainly agree with the hedonist that pleasure is among the things that have intrinsic value and that are good for people, or at least, certain kinds. Maybe they might want to exclude sadistic pleasures or something like that. But certainly, for the most part, innocent pleasures, at least, are certainly good. But then there just seem to be a lot of other things that matter in addition in a way that isn't purely reducible to the pleasure that we get from them. So I think maybe one of the strongest and sort of intuitively strongest cases is to think of the value of love. So, important relationships, sort of, spouses, parents for their children, these kinds of things. It seems to me that if you imagine a case where you basically, actually, let me rewind a little bit and give a concrete case that will help to make this. So it's basically a robot swap case. So you imagine that you've got a duplicate world, which is just like ours, except that all of the sentient beings are replaced by functionally very similar non-conscious robots. Okay, so that world is sort of a parallel universe, parallel to ours. So far, so good. And now we ask the question, would it be bad or would it affect value in any way if, say, you go to some like family man on earth who's like very dedicated to his wife, to his children. They're like central life projects is to really look after his family and provide for them and so forth. And we imagine some sort of evil demon or something deciding to swap this man for his robot twin. And so he gets teleported over to the robot world. His robot twin gets teleported into our world. So everybody's subjective experiences remain unchanged from this point forward. They continue to interact with things that seem functionally similar to their family from before. They can't tell any difference. But still, it seems to me that this is a really bad event. It's been very harmful for the family man who no longer actually has any interactions with his wife or children anymore, who he was previously so dedicated to. And presumably it's also bad for his family who no longer have interactions with him. So just this basic idea that interacting with other people is important in addition to just internal sensations of pleasure.
Yeah, so one question that I would have is, do you think that there are certain things that you think are objectively good, independent of their quality, of their nature, in terms of whether they influence how much happiness or suffering is experienced in people's lives? Would you say the same thing of things that are bad? So, for example, would you say that there are certain things that are bad, independent of their? Well, I guess that wasn't an example. That was just what I was saying. Things that are bad, independent of having detrimental impacts on the well-being of conscious creatures.
So there are two questions. So one is whether there can be things that are bad for the well-being of someone without being bad for their subjective experiences, without detrimentally affecting their experiences. And then there's a further question, could something be bad without affecting anyone's welfare? I think pretty confident yes on the question of could things be bad for a person, like for their welfare, without affecting their consciousness. And I'm open to the possibility that things could be bad even without affecting anyone's welfare. I'm less committal on that question. So maybe there could be just, destroying all the beautiful waterfalls and nature and stuff in the world, even after all sentient beings are gone. Maybe that's some additional badness there. I don't think that's a huge deal compared to the importance of sentient creatures' well-being. But yeah, for harms, I guess I would be inclined to think that there's a sort of symmetry there, that someone could be made badly off without realizing it, to at least a moderate extent. So someone, a mathematician whose central life project is to like prove some important unknown theorem, they think they've done it, and so they're really happy about it. But then it turns out after their death that it's disproven, and everyone sort of laughs at them and considers them a fool. Seems like they're worse off in that case compared to an alternative in which they really did achieve their life goal, and they were, subsequently sort of venerated and regarded as a great mathematical genius by posterity.
Yeah, so one worry that I have about objective list theories is for all of the things that seem to accompany the objective list, they all seem to be things that on a hedonist account are instrumentally desirable. And so, love almost always increases happiness. And in the rare cases where love doesn't seem to increase happiness, it doesn't seem as plausible that it's part of the objective list. So if a person is in a relationship where they're in love, but they're not actually happy in the relationship, I think that many people, or I think that a reasonable judgment is that they should leave the relationship. And so, yeah, so in terms of the objection that all of the things that seem to be part of the objective list just can be reducible to heuristics for maximizing happiness, what would you say to that objection?
Yeah, so I agree to some extent with the premise that pleasure seems to be highly correlated with other sort of putative objective values, and maybe even the stronger claim that it might even be essential, that if you had the other things without pleasure, they might not be valuable anymore. So certainly, toxic relationships aren't going to have intrinsic value, and maybe at least one sign of a relationship being a toxic one would be that it's not actually making either of the people involved at all happy. So I do go along to some extent with that premise. Where I get off the boat is the inference from that to the conclusion that therefore the pleasure is the only thing that's valuable about it. And the reason why I get off the boat is because if it were true that pleasure was the only thing that was valuable about it, and these things were just instrumental to pleasure, then that would then license the further conclusion that these things were fungible values. If something's merely instrumental, it can be replaced with any other effectively, equally effective instrument to that same end, and you should be indifferent. But it doesn't seem true that we should be indifferent to being replaced with our, robo spouses and so forth, and that kind of weird swap experiment I imagined. That doesn't, I don't think most of us would, in fact, be indifferent to that prospect. And moreover, I don't think that we should be indifferent. I don't think that we're making a mistake when we think it matters that we're actually interacting with the people that we care about in positive ways. So that's the thing that really drives me to think that even though they're correlated, there is something more there, that it's not just the pleasure that's the only value, but rather we should care non-instrumentally about the actual connections to other people themselves when, in appropriate circumstances, when they're actually worthwhile, valuable connections.
So would your view be like Parfit's view, that what matters is not, so it's not just that things on the objective list being fulfilled, it is the conjunction of things that are of getting well-being from things that are on the objective list that make them valuable. If things that were on the objective list, or sorry, I say well-being, I got into the habit of saying well-being when I meant happiness, which is a really bad habit because well-being means whatever's non-instrumentally good for person. But so I try to say like positive hedonic experiences, but I sometimes say well-being. But yeah, so is your view that what matters is that there is a pair between things that are part of the objective list and them actually increasing the quality of our hedonic experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super committed to the precise details of the view, but that's what I lean towards, is currently thinking is most plausible, is some sort of hybrid view that combines the two, just like that. And actually, coming back to your earlier sort of coincidence argument, isn't the fact that they coincide evidence that actually it's the pleasure that's the fundamental thing all along? I think one worry there is that it seems that to some extent, all three of the major theories of well-being, desire theories as well as objectivist and hedonism, tend to coincide in practice a fair amount. And given that fact, you could run a similar kind of argument to try to reduce this seeming value of pleasure and hedonism to one of the others. So, for example, a preferentist could say, well, people tend to want pleasure, so can't we just reduce the value of the sort of hedonic value that can be reduced to the value of desire fulfillment? And I don't think that that's particularly plausible either, partly just because we can imagine cases where they come apart, and then Parfit has these nice cases involving the sort of agony argument of strange creatures who don't care about agony and so forth. But anyways, undermines to some extent the sort of moving just from the things coincide, so one of them doesn't actually matter intrinsically.
Well, but I mean, I think that the case for preference views overlapping is stronger than the case for thinking that well-being only matters instrumentally to the extent that it fulfills our preferences is stronger than the case for thinking that happiness is only good to the extent that it fulfills our desires than it is to think that happiness is only good to because it fulfills things that are part of the objective list. Given that there are huge numbers of things that people encounter in everyday life that bring them happiness that they seem to think are good, that are not plausible candidates for being part of the objective list. So like eating ice cream, it doesn't seem like eating ice cream is good independent of making us happy. And so that doesn't seem like a plausible candidate for being on the that doesn't seem like a plausible candidate for the objective list.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So certainly for the objective list theorists, they're going to count pleasure as one of the goods. They're not going to get rid of it completely.
Yeah. So in terms of the view of the type that Parfit espoused, so a couple of objections. So one of them is that there's the issue of how much happiness has to be paired with how good the experience is. So suppose that a person only gets a very small amount of happiness from being in a relationship. Do they get the full goodness of do they get the full goodness of that's achieved by relationships being part of the objective list of good things, or does it scale in terms of with how much happiness they get?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure what the best answer would be there. I'd probably need to run through a sort of series of examples with more sort of detail to try to work out which has the least sort of counterintuitive implications. It's the sort of thing where I suspect that either, whichever way you go, you're probably going to have some costs, but you just need to sort of look at enough cases to work out overall which seems like the least costly way to go. I mean, my suspicion, just off the top of my head, it's not a question I've thought about in detail before. My suspicion would probably be that maybe the sort of proportional way might make more sense, might be more principled, but again, I reserve the right to revise that judgment upon being pressed with more difficult cases.
Yeah. I think that the view according to which it only matters if we also get well-being from it, I think that does get out of some of the objections to objective list theory. But it does start to seem somewhat ad hoc that we have to pair any good experience with, or that things that are part of the objective list have to be paired with a good experience, particularly combined with the fact that it seems like the only plausible candidates for beings that for which things that possess a list of objectively good things are beings that are capable of experiencing well-being and suffering. So if we had a robot that had a series of happiness and pain. So if we had a robot that had the ability to that had desires and was functionally the same as humans, except it just had no enjoyable or unenjoyable mental states, it had no happiness or suffering, it seems like its interests would not matter. Well, it's not clear that it could have desires, but maybe it could. But in contrast, if we think of just a sentient gargoyle that's able to experience pain but can't move or do anything, it seems like that being possesses moral relevance. And so it seems like all of the things that the objective list theorist cares about are only for beings that are able to experience well-being and suffering. And they're also stipulating or happiness and misery. And they're also stipulating that they only apply in cases where they're paired with happy experiences. And so it seems like on both simplicity grounds and on the sort of ad hocness of supposing that it's only for this particular type of beings and it has to be paired with a positive hedonic state, that undercuts objectivist theories.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one way to make it seem a bit less arbitrary is to think of the ultimate good here as something like appreciating things that are genuinely worthwhile. And then, I mean, I don't think that's the only way to go, because you might want there to be some things where you didn't have to have the experience requirement as part of it, but at least for a sort of a rough first pass to what most of the form that most of the value on the theory will take, you could have it something along the lines of sort of appreciating something that actually warrants that kind of positive response. And that's going to help you to distinguish between the kind of the deluded individual is in this sort of world surrounded by robots versus the person who actually has genuine relationships and so forth. They might have all the same subjective experiences, so they take themselves to be appreciating the same things, but in fact only one of them actually does have successful relationships that they're appreciating, and the other one is sort of subject to, they're responding to an illusion effectively. And so if it's something like appreciating genuinely worthwhile things, that's going to distinguish the cases, and it's no longer ad hoc that there's the subjective element is an important part of having the value be realized in your life. It's not enough to just sort of shove knowledge into someone's head who doesn't even care about knowledge in the first place.
Sure. Going back a little bit to the example that you gave of if we switch out the alien world for the other person. So prior to reflection, I do have a slight intuition that action would be bad. But I certainly don't have the intuition that after that point, all the positive experiences that the person would get from being in love, that their value is moot. So I think that if we could, after doing the switch, if we could press a button that had no benefits, but would just make it so that the happiness that they got from being in love was diminished by 30%, let's say, it seems like it would be quite a bad action to press that button. And so it seems like in that case, they're still getting value, or they're getting value from a fake experience, and it seems like maybe that has some diminished value, but it certainly still has some value. Sure.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. So, I mean, you're going to want sort of all innocent pleasures to have some positive value on the objectivist account, even if it's ultimately a sort of a misguided appreciation. You don't get the value of appreciating the good, but you do get the value of just pleasure, whatever that is. Okay, so your view would be that at that point, the value of it would be something like the value of eating ice cream, in that's not good because it contributes to the objective list of good things. But it is good just because, eating ice cream brings joy to people. That's right. And I think a test for this is to sort of think about, is it fungible? Is it substitutable? So, your life, you should be indifferent about eating an ice cream or getting a sort of an equal pleasure from some other source, right? And then if you imagine sort of from the outside looking at this deluded person who's getting a lot of happiness from this robot family that he believes to be real, you might ask, well, could we, get rid of that family and give him equal pleasure from some other sources? And we might well think, yeah, I mean, if it wouldn't cause them great, it might cause them some agony, so maybe from the heartbreak and so forth. So maybe you need to wipe his memory and all that. But if you could just basically mirror out the particular sort of happiness that he has and replace it with some other equally sort of effective source of pleasure, I think we should probably be indifferent about that. But I think that's very different from the case where there's a genuine, where the person's interacting with other people for real. Okay, so now we can change the case slightly. So suppose that we have, so we create that scenario again, but we clone it. So now we have one person who did the swap, and one person who did not do the swap. So now we have a total of 2 robot worlds and 2 regular worlds. And so we have a choice. We can either diminish the happiness that the person in the otherwise robot world gets from being in love by 20%, or diminish the happiness that the person in the real world gets from being in love by
by, let's say, 10%. Would you say that it would be better to diminish the happiness that the person in the otherwise robot world gets from love by 20%, given that
Interesting.
they're
Good. Okay, so this is a nice test of whether it's not just the pleasure that's reduced, but also the objective good is also sort of proportionally reduced. Yeah, interesting case. I'm tempted to initially think, I'm not super confident in this judgment, but I'm tempted to initially think, yeah, reduce the fake happiness by 20% rather than the real happiness by 10.
okay.
Does that seem terribly wrong to you?
Well, I mean, it's hard to have that strong of intuitions about like strange cases involving robot swaps, but it definitely does seem incorrect. So
that could be a reason to go the other route then and have that the objective value doesn't diminish proportionately, but rather they still have the full value of the relationship, and it's just the hedonic value that's been reduced. And I think that would be a fine way to go to, if for someone who had your intuition there but wanted to not be stuck with thinking that swaps were fine.
Sure, but so if we think that the value of so if we think that the value of the hedonic experience, that the hedonic experience becomes that the value comes from, so the pair of being part of the objective list and having a positive associated hedonic state, that produces some value, but then the value of the being part of the objective list doesn't increase very much, or doesn't increase at all when we increase their happiness. It's just the value of the objective list that increases. Well, so one trouble with that view is that it seems like there comes to be this strange incentive to maximize doing things that are paired with things on the objective list, even if you only get a little bit of happiness from them. So if a person could, let's say, like if let's say a person is considering whether or not to enter a relationship, and that relationship will only bring them a minuscule amount of pleasure. It seems like the overall balance of happiness minus suffering that they have over the course of that relationship is very slightly positive. It doesn't like it. It seems like that the value of entering into the relationship in the first place should not change with small jumps in their overall hedonic experience. So it shouldn't be the case that if it'll bring them, let's say the relationship in total will cause them 1,000 units of sadness and 1,000 units of happiness. In that case, then their overall hedonic state doesn't change. So in that case, there's no value to it. But if it's 1,001 units of happiness, then it becomes very valuable. It seems like very small differences at the margins shouldn't have dramatic effects in terms of how much in terms of how great the value of entering the relationship in the first place is.
Yeah, good. That does seem a pretty decisive objection to the hybrid view, which says some pleasure is essential, but it doesn't matter how much. I think that would be a reason to, if you thought that the proportional view didn't work for the other reasons we went before, it seemed like you would then need to resort to a kind of a old-fashioned objective list theory, which didn't have the hybrid element at all. It said pleasure is an important thing, maybe a majority of your well-being comes from pleasure, but there are these other completely independent goods. As long as they are a genuinely good relationship rather than a bad one, that has to be determined on some grounds other than just how much pleasure you get from it. So that could be a way to go. I still lean more towards the proportional view that we said before, even though I thought the intuition I reported seemed wrong to you. But yeah, no, it's helpful to sort of spell out the different implications there to get the options on the table.
Sure. So thinking about the proportional view, so just to be clear, the implication that would be that in terms of how much it increases your well-being. And note, I'm using well-being correctly here, unlike many previous times of this conversation. that how great the increase of your well-being is from some event will will be like you multiply whether the value of the objective list part by the value of the hedonic experience that you get from it.
Yeah, something along those lines. I mean, I'm really thinking of appreciation as maybe slightly broader than just hedonic pleasure. So, I mean, in particular, your example of the relationship there got me thinking of, you could imagine reducing the happiness and increasing the suffering, so that on net you maybe weren't really getting that much net pleasure from the relationship, but you nonetheless appreciated it in some sort of deeper sense. So maybe partly you had positive attitudes towards it. You saw it as sort of enriching your life, and so there are certain kinds of positive evaluations that are tied with it. So, I mean, I think the big challenge for objectiveless theory from the sort of alienation objection, the worry about, things that just don't do anything for you, is when thinking about goods that are on the list, but that the agent doesn't subjectively appreciate in any way. And it seems to me maybe there are multiple ways that you could subjectively appreciate a good that would make it qualify for the objective list. So one, obviously, is if you enjoy it, but maybe actually possibly deeper one is actually a more some kind of attitudinal rather than purely sort of sensational kind of response of just almost more like desiring it. So sort of as a pro attitude of that sort. But again, that too will come in degrees. And so there'll be the question of, well, do you need to sort of appreciate it like as much as is warranted? And if you appreciate it a bit less, eventually get to zero, then maybe the objective value is also proportionately reduced. So I think you'll get the same structure, whether it's hedonic or something more sort of desire-based or value judgmenty.
Yeah. So you read an article where you gave an objection to non-consequentialist views based on what would Satan do, basically? What would a maximally evil individual do? And then you said, well, they would probably be consequentialist, but in terms of maximizing bad things. So they would they would not kill one to save five. They would rather let the five die. But I think that a somewhat similar type of objection can happen or can make sense for against the type of objectivist theory that you think is correct. In that it seems like a lot of the intuitions only make a lot less sense when we're talking about negative experiences. So, I mean, the most common sort of anti-hedonism argument is the experience machine. But the negative experience machine, where it's just simulated torture seems precisely as bad as actual torture.
Sure. I mean, there are other things that might be genuinely bad for you that wouldn't be as bad for you in the negative experience machine. So it might be, torture is just sensory, so it doesn't matter whether it's, realized in a physical world or in a solipsistic experience machine. But there are other bads where you have sort of a torturous response because of your beliefs about the ways that other people are reacting to you, for example. So suppose that it's a psychological, you have a sort of an episode of psychological torture because in this negative experience machine, you are led to believe that everybody hates you and there's all these kind of, all your relationships have fallen apart. So you've got all these sort of connections to your beliefs about other real people and their sort of relationships to and sort of interactions with you. But actually none of those interactions are real. So, maybe part of the experience machine is, the father who somehow like terribly messed up and his children died as a result. This could be part of the negative experience machine and they're plagued by guilt. And it seems to me that actually that person is not nearly as badly off if it's just all a negative hallucination than if someone for whom that was the reality and they actually had let their children die or killed them or something. That would be a lot worse, not just morally, like for the kids, but worse for this, the dedicated father who messed up their children's lives and let them die. That would be worse for the well-being of the father. So I guess I'm not convinced by your intuition about this asymmetry between positive and negative there. I think there can be extra negatives to the things being externally really as bad as you believe they are subjectively.
Yeah. So I think that I'm trying to think of if there are examples of things that we think would generally be on, that we think that in terms of the objective list of things that would be bad independent of their hedonic impact, and whether we think that they would be equally bad in the experience machine. And it seems like there's reasonable. It seems like a lot of those do seem to be equally bad in the experience, in the negative experience machine. One other argument for hedonism is just that it's much simpler. So rather than positing a sort of complex and disunified account of things that are good, that involves supposing that that like love and friendship and knowledge, presumably, that all of those things are good. It just requires presupposing that there's one type of good thing. Now, you wrote an article where you said that you don't think that response works necessarily, because we're already positing that there's some sort of desirable things, a variety of different kinds of experiences that are all good, that are being introduced into our ontology. So it's not clear why it's any less parsimonious to presuppose that why presupposing that there are many different types of positive experiences is any less parsimonious than presupposing that there are many different types of good things that are non-experiential. And my objection to that would be that I think that all of those things seem to have a common property of well-being, or of producing a positive hedonic tone, such that upon experiencing them, if we sort of think carefully, we'll realize that we would think that they're bad upon experiencing them. And so that seems to be different instantiations of one type of thing. But that there doesn't seem to be any underlying sort of thing that unifies all the members of the objective list. What would you say to that reply?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely true. So hedonism is more unified in its contents than objectiveless theory. Objectiveless theory has a more diverse account of things that are good. So that's true. Now the question, I guess, is it in any way a philosophical cost to have a broader account of things that are good? So one kind of way of trying to make the argument is through a kind of Occam's razor parsimony thing. You're like multiplying entities beyond necessity if you're saying there are many different types of goods, many different things that are good, even whether unified or disunified. And I guess my argument is sort of meant to be a response to that kind of way of trying to turn this into an objection. So rather than just observing, yeah, you've got more things on your list. When you make the case that no, there's more things that are multiplying entities beyond necessity, that's when I respond by saying, well, I mean, I'm not adding more things into existence. You already agree that there are lots of pleasures out there and there are relationships out there. And there is, for all of us, this property of being desirable of something that you ought to care about or that makes your life go better when your life contains it. And now the question is just, which of these objects does this higher order property of contributing to your welfare, of being desirable for your own sake, which things does this attach to? The hedonist says it attaches to just the pleasurable experiences. I say it attaches to those and some other things in addition. But in a sense, I'm not adding more properties into the world. I'm not multiplying entities in that sense. I'm just saying there's more instantiations of this property that you've already granted exists, namely being a welfare contributant. It's a little bit like, if someone were to raise a parsimony, sort of suggest that parsimony should make you believe that there are fewer pleasures in existence rather than more. It's like, well, no, I mean, once you've already on board with there existing such a thing as pleasure, it doesn't really matter how many times it's instantiated. That's not the relevant kind of cost to a philosophical theory or a physical one for that matter.
Sure. I mean, I think that the distinction would be that I think that the same mechanism that allows saying the different types of play, like the mechanism that causes pleasures to be good. Well, saying mechanism is somewhat misleading, but whatever it is that makes it so that there are good types of hedonic states that exist in the world, there's no reason to suppose that that mechanism would be limited to a particular small number of different types of positive hedonic experiences. But it seems like we have to posit a fundamentally distinct mechanism in order to explain in order to explain how the other things are good. And I mean, so in terms of the account of hedonic experiences that I'm somewhat sympathetic to, and I think you would reject this because you're an epiphenomenalist, or at least somewhat sympathetic to epiphenomenalism. But it seems like if we accept that mental states play a causal role in terms of the actions that we take, then suffering, which is the type of mental states that are just bad non-instrumentally and that can be just recognized immediately to be bad, there's a plausible evolutionary reason for them to arise. Namely, if you suffer every time you take a certain action, then you're less likely to take that action in the future. And if we suppose that there are at least metaphysically possible mental states that are bad independent of desires, then I think we can give a plausible evolutionary account of how beings would evolve to have those actual experiences that are non-instrumentally bad. But it doesn't seem like any plausible account for the objective list theory works like that, given that the objective list theory it relates to facts about the external world that are not changeable by evolution.
So I'm a little puzzled by a couple of steps in this argument. So I guess the first thing that I think is a bit troubling was, as you sort of flagged yourself initially, this use of the word mechanism to describe how it is that we relate things in the natural world, natural properties, pleasure, happiness, whatever, with normative conclusions of what's, contributes to your well-being or otherwise. So I don't think we need a mechanism to do that. I think that's a bad sort of picture to imagine that, goodness is like a little glowing halo, and we need some mechanism that attaches the halos to atoms in the world. And, wouldn't it be simpler to just have the one mechanism that responds to pleasure than to have to add another mechanism that also adds halos to other things like relationships and knowledge or whatever. So I think that's a sort of a bad picture. We shouldn't be imagining adding little golden halos to physical things in the world. It's not a thing like that. These normative properties aren't that sort of that kind of entity where you'd need a mechanism to realize them. Rather, we should just think of it as being sort of the question of what's the right answer to the question of what's worth caring about. So, better. I think it's more natural to think of it in terms of normative truths than in terms of, normative properties or things like that to some extent. So, if we just think what's the true answer to the question of what matters, it's not clear that you need a mechanism to give you a truth, a mechanism to answer that question correctly and to work out, well, it's not just pleasures, but these other things too. I don't think that the truth maker for that question needs to rely on anything that's at all analogous to a mechanism. So I guess that's why I sort of reject that argument that you offer. I think it sort of rests on a misleading presupposition, and that when we sort of reframe the question the way that I think is better, I think that to some extent the objection just doesn't arise, or at least it's not so clear to me why there's anything philosophically worse about a more diverse answer than a more unified one, as long as all of the items that you give in your answer do seem to be correct and mutually consistent and not contradictory in any way. And then you sort of moved on to this evolutionary argument, and I might need you to sort of maybe elaborate on that a little bit or clarify what you had in mind there. So you talked about how we can give an evolutionary explanation of suffering evolving, and I'm on board with that. I mean, to some extent, I would think the evolutionary explanation is really for the sort of neural correlates of suffering and the behavioral mechanisms that go along with it, of being averse to certain responses, particularly tissue damage and so forth. Is it good evolutionary explanations of all that arising? And then, of course, the subjective experience of pain and suffering just follows when your brain is in the right kind of state. So to some extent, I'm on board with that, but I'm not really sure what that has to do with ethics and the question of whether it's good or bad for you. I don't think that evolution, what's selected for by evolution, is either necessarily good or bad or has any normative valence at all. So insofar as we've got the question of not just how did these things arise in the world, but what makes which things are good or bad, which we care about, I think they're just very separate questions. So could you say a little bit more about why you're talking about evolution in this context?
Yeah, so I agree that evolution does not have any intrinsic normative implications, but there are many things, like most things in the universe, are not things to which there are any normative about which there are not any normative truths. So there are no if assuming that a galaxy 50 galaxies away, assuming that there's no life in that galaxy, there are no normative truths to be known about that galaxy. And so the question is how does evolution produce beings for which morality that are the type of beings to which morality applies? And I think that a hedonist account can give some sort of rough sketch of that, which is, well, to the extent that we think that we're not epiphenomenalists. So yeah, you wouldn't be on board with that, but that we would expect suffering to arise. To the extent that suffering is non-instrumentally bad, we could expect suffering to arise as to deter actions that are not conducive to evolutionary fitness. And the fact that suffering is bad, when we experience suffering, we become aware of that fact. And so that functions, the fact that it is bad serves to deter us from engaging in actions that cause our own suffering. And so I think the argument was that we can provide a sort of very rough evolutionary account of how we would get predicates to which morality would apply on a hedonist account. But I don't think that there's any way of doing that on an objectivist theorist account.
I see. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So I guess my inclination is to respond to that by thinking we maybe shouldn't expect sort of evolutionary explanations to be at the right kind of level to by themselves explain things like why moral patients evolved or why well-being candidates evolved. Rather, I think we just sort of need to break it into further sub-questions. So one question is, what does it take to be a candidate for having well-being? And I think I'm inclined to agree with you here that the answer is you need to be a sentient being that's capable of sort of positive and negative affective responses. And if that's the question of what it is to be a candidate for well-being, then the question of how is it that such creatures evolved then is sort of indirectly reducible to the question of, well, how is it that creatures capable of positive and negative affect evolved? And I can give the same answer as you to that question, or at least, modulo the epiphenomenal stuff. So to some extent, I don't think that the question of well-being itself, or what constitutes well-being, is necessarily essential to answering the question of how is it that there are creatures to whom well-being or morality applies? Because that might be, you might give the same answer to that regardless of what particular answer to what well-being consists in you then go on to give. It might be that no matter your theory of well-being, everyone agrees that it's just sentient beings to whom it applies, for example.
Sure. So would your view be that there are a vast number of things that are part of the objective list that humans will never experience? So like we could have imagined a world that was like this world, but just without love. And so then love would be part of the objective list, but it would never be experienced by humans. So your view is that there are just huge numbers of things on the objective list that are unfulfilled by any of us.
It's at least an open possibility. obviously can't particularly conceive of something that's inaccessible to humans and nonetheless valuable. But it seems like an open conceptual possibility. And actually, when you were talking about the galaxy far away, for which you thought no normative truths applied, actually, I was initially thinking, well, that's not necessarily true, because there could be these dispositional normative truths. So there could be beautiful waterfalls on some of the planets, which are genuinely, beautiful as a normative term. It means that it warrants certain kinds of aesthetic appreciation. So it could be a normative truth about it that if a creature with suitable kind of perceptual apparatus were to be there, they should respond by appreciating that waterfall. And that could be a truth even if there were no creatures there.
Sure. I mean, I think that I was just saying that assuming that no sentient being ever looks upon the beautiful things in that galaxy, then it seems clear that the galaxy's existence just for its own sake is not good. To the extent that we thought that the galaxy's existence for its own sake was good, independent of being viewed or enjoyed by any sentient beings, well, so given that goodness is additive, then there could be a sufficiently large number of galaxies that are really beautiful, whose goodness could outweigh any bad thing on Earth. And so if there were Googleplex unobserved galaxies, then if we attach even a tiny amount of value to each of those galaxies, then the combined total of those unobserved galaxies would dwarf the disvalue of all bad things on Earth. But it seems like if no sentient being is ever going to interact with any of those galaxies, then getting rid of those galaxies would be considerably less bad than the worst events in human history.
Sure. Yeah. So the sorts of dispositional normative truths that I was adverting to aren't ones that make the bare existence of the galaxy with no observers better than its not existing. That's true.
Sure. So going back a little bit to earlier questions about objectivist theory in terms of the view that we multiply the value of the thing that's on the objective list by the value of, or by how much happiness is gleaned from that thing that's on the objective list. So one implication of that is that it seems like it would say that increasing the happiness of a particular experience would become more valuable if that experience is broadly part of the if it's associated with something that's part of the objective list. So suppose that so if we have two scenarios, in scenario one, a person has a moment of epiphany when talking with a person who they're in love with. And in scenario two, they have that moment of epiphany not when talking with a person who they're in love with, assuming that moment of epiphany increases their happiness dramatically. It doesn't seem like they're like the time in which it happens and whether it's part of the broader fulfillment of something of part of the objective list. It doesn't seem like that should it doesn't seem like that should matter for the normative significance of that particular experience.
Yeah, so it might be so for that particular case. One reason for thinking that is just that it's not clear that the moment of epiphany is actually tied to the relationship itself in the right kind of way, or if it's just sort of an incidental experience that, you happen to be in the presence of the other person, you are having some conversation. I mean, maybe you could spell it out in such a way that actually the epiphany, the pleasure you get from the epiphany is tied in with appreciation of the relationship itself. So, maybe there's some joint project you've been working on with your spouse, and it's through working together that you came to this epiphany. And then you might, it might make sense to value the pleasure you got from it more in that case. But if it's just an incidental thing, then I'm inclined to think, well, that's not the pleasure isn't tied to the relationship in the right kind of way to be actually increasing the value of the relationship there. You haven't increased your appreciation of the relationship. And that's the important thing.
Okay.
So I think maybe a better case is if we can just imagine a sort of a choice. So imagine someone who's in what seems in all other respects to be a very sort of successful, valuable relationship that's, positive for their life and their growth and so forth. But they just sort of feel a little bit alienated for a reason that they can't really fathom. They just sort of have a general kind of malaise about their relationship for the time being. And then they have an option between two different ways of increasing their happiness. One is they can just take a pleasure pill that will randomly give them a big burst of happiness, and the other is they can take go through some cognitive behavioral therapy or something, or have a CBT pill that will have the effect of making them better appreciate the value that they recognize as in their relationship, so they don't feel alienated from it in the same way. And suppose they would get significantly more pleasure just from the pleasure pill. The CBT pill, although it would be helpful to some extent, wouldn't make as big a difference just in terms of sensory pleasure. Still, it seems to me that many people would rather take the CBT pill that makes them get the pleasure of appreciating their relationship, even if it was less. And moreover, that it doesn't seem to be a mistake to prefer that. That seems like a reasonable preference. Whereas, of course, the hedonist has to say, no, they're being irrational. Seems too harsh for me to say that that's irrational. It seems very reasonable.
Sure. So one case. So suppose that. So if we have two scenarios. So thinking about objective list theory as kind of multiplying the value of the thing that's part of the objective list, the value of the objective list part by the value of the hedonic experience. That seems to produce slightly weird results if we think that that there are certain if we think that there are certain things that are that are hedonically good, independent of being part of the objective list, and that actually do increase one's well-being. And so like, the eating ice cream example, it's not clear how we would parse that out in terms of the, like, if we think of it as like multiplying the value of the being part of the objective list by the hedonic value of the experience. Well, in the case of eating ice cream, it's not really clear of things that don't seem to factor into the objective list. It's not really clear how we would parse that out. I mean, the most natural thing would be to multiply by 0 because it's not part of the objective list. But that obviously produces implausible results, such as that eating ice cream is not that there's just no value from like experiences of happiness divorced from any like significant life events that could plausibly be part of the objective list.
Yeah, so there's no intrinsic value to eating ice cream. That's the implication. Of course, there's still value to pleasure. So there's just these two different things. There's the value of the ice cream and there's the value of the pleasure. The value of the pleasure is always weighted 100%, right? But we're asking, is there additional objective value to the ice cream? And the answer is no. That's 0 times the pleasure is 0. And so when you've got something else that is valuable, you take pleasure in this sort of intellectual journey you go on, some discoveries you make, that's more valuable. You maybe get a bit less pleasure than you did from the ice cream, but maybe in total it adds up to more because you've got the pleasure of the value of the pleasure, and then you've got the value of the journey of intellectual discovery, which is proportional, discounted if you enjoyed it less than it warranted, but still it was some additional value.
Sure, but earlier you said that when you thought that in the case of the two robot world, when you said that the value of the value of the pleasure changes based on whether or not it's attached to the objective list.
Because it has both instrumental and intrinsic to some extent, or two different forms of intrinsic. So the intrinsic value of the pleasure is unchanged as far as just the hedonic value of pleasure goes, but the pleasure for the person who is having sort of genuine interactions with other people not only increased the hedonic value of the pleasure, but also increased the value of the interactions, because they were appreciating those interactions now when before they weren't. So that's why the pleasure is more valuable, because it's got these two types of value to it rather than just one.
Sure. Well, but But I, earlier, I thought you said that the value that the so wait. So it's your view that the value of the pleasure always remains unchanged, but the value of the being part of the objective list scales depending on how much pleasure there is.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So that 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 hmm, that leaves it so that there are cases where whether or not where the value of happiness depends on whether it's associated with something that's part of the objective list. And so if so I think that you're applied to the earlier example of like having a deep moment of enlightenment when a person's in love is a reason why I think that example does not work particularly well. I'm trying to think if there are other examples of cases where something might be part of the objective list, where it seems counterintuitive to say that the context in which the pleasure is experienced determines how non-instrumentally good it is.
Yeah, so you'd want to come up with a case where it does seem like the pleasure is genuinely counting as appreciation of the objective good. So it should have this extra value on my account, but nonetheless, intuitively, it seems not to. That's the structure you need to look for.
Sure. So you've been talking about appreciation of the objective good, but I'm not sure. So when we think through a lot of the cases where there is a pairing between pleasure and things being part of the objective list, it doesn't seem like necessarily the pleasure is coming from some appreciation of the thing being part of the objective list. So, um, so to take an example, so I mean, in the case of a person being in love, suppose that the person who is in love is a hedonist and thinks and does not think that they're appreciating anything that's good about it. It provides them pleasure, and so they think that the experience is valuable. It doesn't seem like in that case they're appreciating the fact that it's part of the objective list.
Right, they don't need to appreciate that fact. They need to appreciate the thing that actually is on the objective list, which is, the relationship with the other person. So it's a sort of philosophers sometimes call this a de dicto de re distinction. So de dicto is about the words. So some moral motivation, de dicto would be like, I'm motivated to do my duty because it is my duty, sort of Kantian idea. And moral motivation de re is being motivated by the thing that is your duty. I'm motivated to help these people because their suffering matters. I think it's the de re is the right kind of connection here, not de dicto.
Sure. So
though I will flag with your hedonist, it's important that they really are appreciating, intrinsically, the other person in the relationship, not just regarding it as instrumental to their own happiness. That wouldn't be a real relationship, I think, if you were just like, using the other person for your own pleasure. That maybe you could get some pleasure out of that. Maybe according to the paradox of hedonism, you wouldn't get as much. But moreover, you wouldn't be valuing them in the right kind of way to be getting any kind of extra objective value out of that. You'd just be pursuing, you just have the value of the pleasure was the only thing that you're really pursuing there.
Yeah, in the earlier case that I gave, they appreciate that, like they appreciate the relationship because it gives pleasure to both parties. But so they value the other member of the relationship. They're not an egoist. But they don't see it. So, I mean,
would they care about the swap scenario? So would they be bothered at all by the prospect of both them and their partner, who they care about the partner, but if they only care about their partner's happiness, then in a swap scenario where their partner ends up being surrounded by robots, they might still be just as happy. I think if you weren't bothered by that prospect, I would worry a lot about the extent to which you actually valued the relationship at all. That would seem to be missing.
Well, so wait, so would your view be that if they're two hedonist utilitarians who are in a relationship, then in that case, the swap would not be bad.
Well, I'm wondering, depending on their psychology, I mean, they might, plenty of people are, utilitarian at a theoretical level, but then do actually have all these sorts of non-utilitarian attachments. I mean, I'm theoretically a utilitarian, but I certainly don't care about everyone equally in real life, just on an intellectual level. So again, you could have these sort of hedonist utilitarians who are, in effect, kind of, good non-hedonists in practical reality, and they just have this theoretical, this false belief that makes them a bit confused sometimes when doing philosophy, and that's pretty harmless. But if they actually had fully internalized it, so yeah, neither of them actually cared about the relationship intrinsically, but just regarded them as kind of mutual means to each other's pleasure, and they could be swapped around, and it was just a completely fungible thing, then it's not clear to me that that relationship would have the right kind of value anymore. I mean, I'm not totally sure. I'd have to think about that case more. Maybe the fact that they genuinely do care about the other person is enough to get it going. But it seems to be missing something compared to people who are actually, committed to each other as opposed to just happy that each other's pleasure be promoted by any means whatsoever.
Sure. Well, so I mean, in that case, then it seems like the original thought experiment, to the extent that we think that in the case of people, so suppose that there were two people who, so it seems like to the extent that people do not have any desire for the switch not to happen, then it seems like in that case the switch is not the switch is not bad for them.
It might not matter. That's at least a possibility, yeah.
Sure. So I guess one question is, so are
and the reason for that would be they're just as badly off all along as the person who has been switched. They're missing out on the extra objective value of the actual relationship as opposed to just the pleasure gotten from it.
Okay. I mean, I think that the original thought experiment, part of the reason why it seems somewhat counterintuitive is because a lot of people have a desire for that not to be the case, and it's very difficult to theorize about do we desire for something to happen where we wouldn't know about it, but where on our current set of desires we would want it not to happen, and so I think that theorizing about cases like that can produce somewhat misleading results. But in cases where they don't have any desire for the switch not to happen, and to the extent that it stopped seeming counterintuitive, then I think that cuts against the initial intuition to some degree.
Okay, it's not clear to me that it does cut against it, just because I think the intuition's very clear when we consider people who do actually value the state itself. So, I mean, I guess you have these sort of methodological worries about can we properly evaluate cases involving something like ignorance or changing preferences or something along those lines. But I think we can. I mean, we have to be careful about it, but I can definitely imagine some cases of changing preferences which seem fine to me and other ones that seem very disturbing. And to some extent, I take those to sort of track my sort of implicit evaluative beliefs about what's actually important and what differences aren't so important.
Sure. So can you give some more examples of things that you think would be part of the objective list?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. There are some things that I have very strong opinions about, and there are others where I'm sort of much more open-ended. So my strongest opinions in this vicinity are on the idea that sort of connections with other people matter intrinsically over and above just pleasure. I guess I'm inclined to think that there are certain kinds of intellectual values, creativity, things along those lines. People often talk about knowledge. I don't like that one at all, just because I think there's all kinds of completely worthless knowledge, names in a phone book kind of stuff. But maybe understanding of fundamental truths to some extent, the kind of things that tends to drive academics. I think a lot of that does strike me as kind of genuinely worth striving for in a way that suggests it has some objective value. I actually kind of prefer the metaphor rather than objective list, which makes it sound like a totalizing thing where everyone has to be aiming for the same thing. I kind of like the metaphor of an objective menu where there just might be a lot of different valuable things that can be worth pursuing, and you can kind of pick and choose the ones that appeal to you, and someone else could choose very different things, and that could be completely fine, and you could both live wonderful lives. That seems right to me. So I'm pretty open-ended in exactly what should end up there, but I guess the things that spring to mind besides pleasure are sort of loving relationships, connections to other people, creativity, and intellectual pursuits.
Okay, so what would be how would we determine if something is a broader part of appreciation of the thing on the objective list? So, for example, if we suppose that that the two friends are hanging out, presumably that would be an example of fulfillment um, of the objective list, right?
Yeah, could well be.
Sure. So now suppose that two friends are hanging out and they're considering watching. So they're considering watching a movie, and so uh, there's no movie that they both like very much. For each of them, they would each prefer there's a movie that they each really despise the genres that the other one likes. So, but so let's say they would get 20 units of, if they watch the movie that they personally liked, they would get, let's say, 20 units of happiness from that. They would get -40 from watching the movie that their friend likes. And a movie that's an agreed upon compromise, they would get, let's say, 5 units of utility. In that case, like, to the extent that both friends would prefer to just watch their own movie, rather than together watching a movie that they both agree upon, it seems very strange to say that it is better for them to watch a movie together for which both of them would rather watch a movie by themselves without the friend.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's one further detail that we need to specify here is it actually the case that they would both prefer to watch the movie they like more by themselves, or is it just that they would get more pleasure from it? Because it might be that they would both agree that, yeah, I would get in some sense more momentary pleasure from watching the movie by myself that I prefer to see. But all things considered, I prefer to watch a mediocre movie with my friend because of the value of camaraderie or something that's added in there in addition. So I think to some extent, it probably just does depend upon how those trade-offs work. There are possible cases that go either way, but it seems at least, there will be possible cases that in which getting the less pleasure will be something that's better for both of them, and they would even agree with that subjectively.
Sure. So now, going back, changing the scenario slightly. So suppose that they were both watching the movie where they gained 5 units of utility from it, and they could be swapped out with the robot in the other world for the duration of the movie, and then they get switched back. Would that make it so that the movie was less good for both of them, to the extent that they?
Oh, interesting case. Yeah. So when you fiddle around the edges with these sort of temporary swaps, exactly which moments do you need to be present for? Yeah. I don't know. Those are going to be tricky cases. I mean, if part of what they're valuing is the camaraderie, then it might well be that it would be slightly worse for them to be swapped out, because then they're not really watching it together with their friend the way that they were hoping for. It would be more like just watching the movie by themselves, and that didn't have as much value as watching a different movie that they would have preferred to have seen themselves. So I guess I'd lean towards thinking that, yeah, even in this pretty trivial temporary swap, it might make them very slightly worse off. I mean, it's going to be tiny values for this momentary, just a few hours of experience or whatever. But yeah, that's the way I'm tempted to go.
Sure. So this may be an impossible question to give any precise answer to, but about what percentage of the value that you think we get over the course of our lives do you think comes from fulfillment of the members of the objective list, and about what percentage of it do you think comes from the hedonic experience?
Yeah, I have no idea at all. I'm sure I would give completely different answers on like different days of the week if I tried to give my best estimate. That'd probably range from like 25, 75 to the reverse. So yeah, I don't have any consistent answer to that question. It's a very difficult one.
Sure. Well, so if it's any like reasonable amount, then it seems like if we presuppose, if we say that putting someone into the alien world, or not alien, robot world,
The robot.
that makes it so if we put each individual person into their own robot world, then so if we think that the value from the objective list is any reasonable percentage of the total value, then it seems like if we put everyone into their own separate world, then that would just make the world dramatically worse, such that, let's say, so if we think that it makes it, let's say, 30% worse, then
we should be willing to pay significant costs to prevent that. Yeah.
Right. And no, it doesn't seem particularly plausible that making everyone's life like a fifth worse in terms of hedonic experiences is worth doing something for which no one will ever find out about it.
I definitely think it's worthwhile. Like if I thought that like if someone was threatening to like put my child into an experience machine, and I knew that their subsequent life in the experience machine would be like just as good as what they could expect to have otherwise, but they would never have a real connection to another human, never really interact with us again. And then, they put me and my wife and everyone else into corresponding experience machines, so we think we're interacting with our son, but we're really not. No, I would pay a lot in hedonic terms to prevent that from happening, and I think probably any other parent would too.
Sure. So okay, so backtracking slightly to the case of the watching the movie with a friend case. So now suppose that the friends, they have a practice where they like put up a curtain between them when they watch a movie. They still like, appreciate that the other one is there, providing spiritual support or whatever. but they just in no way interact with the other person. And then we transport everyone to the robot world for the duration of the movie, transport everyone back, such that, well, I don't know. I mean, you'll probably give the same results, but the existence of a curtain where neither is observing the other one and they're both staring at the screen that's in front of both of them, like it doesn't seem plausible that the value of that is affected by things that are going on the other side of the curtain that just don't affect their conscious experience at all.
Yeah, I mean, maybe especially if we sort of make it a sort of superpowered curtain, which not only blocks off sight, but in fact prevents any kind of causal interaction between the two sides of the curtain. So there's not even any possibility like one would hear the other coughing or anything like that. They're completely causally isolated from each other for the duration of the movie by the existence of this curtain between them. Yeah, that makes a pretty strong case. It does seem weird then to think, does it really matter that the other person is there on the other side of this causally isolated space from you? Yeah, it's kind of hard to see why that would matter. So that might push one towards thinking that some kind of causal interaction is an important part of actually having it count as a value of the relevant kind. That mere presence in a geographic space is maybe not enough. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe someone could say, well, particularly if you go more a desire theory, a sort of desire route, they might just care that the other person is there watching the movie with them, and they are having this joint experience of the same screen, and reacting to it, simultaneously. And if someone cared about that, maybe that would be an expression of their friendship and something that could count as hooking into the objective values in the right way. I could see someone making that argument. So I'm pulled in both directions by this one. It's a fun case.
Sure. So in the case of the so if you think that, so obviously the amount is going to be very uncertain, but if we think that so for even if it's a fairly small amount, let's say we think that like half of the value of a person's life comes from their hedonic experience and half of it comes from the objective list part. So it seems like in that case, then it would be worth plugging into the experience machine, as long as we stipulate that the happiness that one would get in the experience machine would be twice as great.
Yeah, so it might depend a little bit. I don't think we have to be committed to a sort of completely additive account of the value of these things. So I think on reflection, in fact, the sort of additive view seems pretty wrong to me. So one way to see this is to think about how much risk would you be willing to take on for a chance at something like close to immortality. I mean, maybe literal immortality might not be. It's controversial whether that would be good, but say, an extra million years of positive life. It seems to me that you shouldn't be willing to take a huge, 99% chance of death in order to have a 1% chance of living for a million years. That doesn't even seem prudent to me. And it's not due to risk aversion, but rather it's not the case that living 1,000 times as long or 10,000 times as long is 1,000 or 10,000 times better in terms of the total value of the sort of welfare value of your life. One reason for thinking this is that you might think a significant portion of our life might part of the value might come from things like things that aren't necessarily repeatable in the right kind of way. So sort of what you want to achieve, so these sort of global preferences, and sort of how well they're achieved. And so you might think a sort of normal human lifespan is kind of enough to achieve most of the big projects you're likely to have, or not all of them you will achieve, but you've got time enough to do it, to give them a good shot. And whereas expanding it way massively beyond that, there could definitely still be advantages to it. I'm not poo-pooing the idea of life extension, but I don't think it's proportionate. I don't think it's as important compared to how terrible it would be to die when you're 20 and not get to have everything, all those distinctive values you would have achieved between 20 and 80. So that makes me think that something like the hedonic value shouldn't just be a purely additive thing that goes up and up without limit. Maybe it's something like constrained by our global preferences, that maybe, a global preference we have is to live a sufficiently happy life or something like that. And you might end up getting some kind of asymptotic sort of effect where more pleasure beyond a certain point just doesn't add that much more.
Sure. I think that, I think that in terms of whether we would want to live an extra large number of years of life, I think that there is declining marginal utility to one's life. It seems like people get less happy over time. But if we stipulated that was not the case, then I think that there's a pretty solid argument for at least let's say it's a question of a 0.0001% chance of an extra billion years of life. Let's assume that.
And otherwise guaranteed death at 20?
Sure. Or it wouldn't have to be at 20. It could be at wait, sorry. Or are you saying that the case that I was describing is one has a 0.001% chance of a billion extra years and a 0.999, maybe there may have been missing or adding an extra 9 percent chance of dying immediately. So in that case, I think that there's a pretty strong argument for for why it would be worth taking that deal over the present conditions, which is, so suppose that we could add an extra 100 years of life for a, let's say 5% chance of death. That seems like it would be worth it, right?
Not obvious.
It's not obvious that an extra 100 years of happy life would, okay.
I mean, it depends. It's definitely possible. It could well be. But it's not immediately obvious. I don't think we have to be committed to that. It, depends how much. You might just think that actually sort of doubling your lifespan is not going to be anywhere close to doubling the value of your life. But
Sure.
maybe it would be like, maybe it would be worth at least 10% more. So a 5% chance could be worth it.
I mean, so, well, and then we can continue the process. So we can add an extra 10% for an extra 100,000 years of life, let's say. And given how big of a number a billion is, for any, unless we stretch it out to just be a vast amount, then by the time we get to,
so I think the later increments are going to have effectively diminishing value, not instrumentally the way you were thinking before, but in a sense, something more like intrinsically. So once you've had one increment of extra 100 years, the next increment of 100, you're going to have to get much better odds. It wouldn't be worth it for, the same for a 5% risk of death anymore.
I mean, in your article for utilitarianism.net, you argued that deontology was a form of status quo bias. And I worry that this might also be status quo bias. It seems like a remarkable coincidence that that the like optimal value that in terms of your life, that the point at which things sharply decline in terms of value are when you reach about the age at which most people die.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think that this is like a necessary truth or anything. I think it might be more a matter of, given the sort of base expectations that we have and the preferences that we've formed about our lives, given those ordinary sorts of preferences, the things that we care about are likely to be achievable within these sort of ordinary lifespans. But it's possible. I could certainly imagine a case where you sort of enculturate someone very differently, such that they form very different kinds of projects that couldn't be completed within an ordinary human lifespan, and then it might well be worthwhile for that very different individual to take these kinds of gambles. So to some extent, I think it's sort of a contingent matter of what values we're latching onto and we care about. And there might be some that would be available for beings with much longer lifespans, but they're not ones that I care about in the way that I currently care about the things that I do. So yeah. So I think
Sure.
that's sort of partly a way of us saying, yes, there's an element of status quo bias, but it's maybe slightly more principled, because this might be a case where actually our existing preferences help to partly determine what would count as good for our lives. So there can be kind of a subjective element to it.
Sure. So jumping around slightly, but going back.
To go in 5 minutes.
Okay. Going back to the case earlier of the value of the experience, depending on whether it's associated with a part of the objective list. So that has a slightly strange implication, which is that, so suppose that a person who someone's in love with like bakes them cookies or whatever. It seems like the value versus the robot alien switch happening before the cookies are made. It seems like even though when they eat the cookies, they perhaps like appreciate their loved one, making the cookies out of regard for their interest. It seems like the value of eating the cookies should not be held captive to whether or not the alien swap occurred. Like, it doesn't seem like that decreases the value of the eating of the cookies.
I mean, it certainly doesn't decrease the value of the pleasure, just the sort of raw sensory pleasure of the cookies, the gustatory pleasure or whatever. That's certainly unchanged. So then I guess there's just the question, should it change the value of this extra element of sort of appreciation of the relationship that the cookies is giving you? And there, I guess, I'm inclined to think it's probably right that as long as the cookies were baked by one's real partner, that you can get real appreciation of that genuine relationship there out of that, even if the swap subsequently has occurred, so they're no longer present with you. You can appreciate the relationship that was, and that can help to boost your appreciation in positive, valuable ways. Whereas if the swap had occurred before the cooking of the cookies, the baking of the cookies, then it would no longer be an accurate appreciation of that relationship there. It wouldn't have the right causal connection. So I think that does make a difference there.
Okay, so now, so then, at what point, when they're baking, in the process of the baking the cookies, does the swap make that it lose moral relevance? So suppose that they've made the decision that they're going to bake the cookies, but have not started the baking process. I mean, there might be it may be difficult to draw a precise line, but any line that we could conceivably draw just seems quite implausible.
Yeah, it would seem most principled to think it's going to be a proportional thing, right? So that if, if there's half of the time spent baking the cookies was by the real person and half was taken over by the robot, maybe it counts half towards this objective an objective connection. That's one option. I mean, and I'm not sure about that. Maybe a better way to go is to think, no, it just really matters whether it is whether your partner and their concern for you was ultimately causally responsible for the event ending up happening. And then, I mean, that's going to be a tricky one, because in some sense you might think even if they're swapped before the baking starts at all, or even before they form the intention, still it's because they cared about you that the robot goes through the motions of baking cookies. So there's a causal connection of sorts, but maybe it needs to be a specific, something like a specific intention or something along those lines. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, sure. Last question. So go back. We can go back to a case involving two friends watching a movie. No alien curtains this time. So the question is, well, actually, maybe alien curtains. So does the value of the moments when they're watching a movie, when they are purely focusing on the plot of the movie and not focusing on the fact that they're watching it with their friend and that they appreciate their friends watching the movie with them, etc. Does the value, when the moments where they're just fully absorbed by the movie, does the value of that change with whether or not their friend gets robot swapped?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Another one of these tricky sort of borderline questions where it's not immediately obvious what's the best way to go. I mean, I think my initial inclination is still to think probably the best option will be to say, yeah, any kind of swap detracts to some extent from their shared experience, and so will be somewhat less of the sort of value of camaraderie and friendship as being realized there. But I'm definitely not super confident in that initial reaction. Do you see sort of an obvious problem with going that way, or you're just sort of curious?
Well, it seems somewhat strange and arbitrary for the value of the parts of the experience when they're just not even thinking about their friend. The parts of the movie where they're fully absorbed by it. It seems very strange that if we could make a better movie, if we could make the movie slightly better in either the world of the robot swap world or the non-robot swap world, it doesn't seem significantly more important to make the movie better in the non-alien swap world, particularly in parts where they're fully absorbed by where they're focusing on the movie and are not thinking about their friend. Wait, I say alien. I don't know why I'm doing.
Yeah, no, I get robot. What you mean. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's not obvious. I think it's also not obviously wrong. I think it's just pretty unclear what the right thing to say about that kind of case is. I mean, if you imagine a slight variation on it, where you're asking Suppose that one of the friends, during one of these sort of moments of intense focus on the movie itself, one of them could just have a weird mental episode where they just sort of start hallucinating a better movie, like a better like stage of that movie than what's actually on the screen. Would that be a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously, hedonically, it's a good thing. They're getting more pleasure from the hallucinated version than the real thing they're watching. But maybe it's partly a bad thing because they're no longer having the shared experience with their friend that they really wanted to have. It's not hugely important. It's not going to ruin their life, but maybe there's a slight detriment there. So I think it's just one of those things where you can kind of see there is a consideration on going both ways, and it's just sort of a question of how they balance out, and it's going to be very hard to give sort of precise, systematic answers to all questions of that kind.
Okay. You said you had to go in like 5 minutes. That seemed like it was roughly 5 minutes ago.
All right. Yeah, should head off, but I've enjoyed the chat. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
I'm especially glad that you're like a real person on the other end that I've gotten to have this enlightening discussion with, rather than just if you were a non-conscious robot and I was just talking into empty space here, that wouldn't be as good.
Yeah. Well, I can't say that I share that preference, having a hedonist account of value, but I've enjoyed the chat. Thanks for watching, everyone.